Ooh, so traditional witchcraft versus Wicca. You're gonna get an increasing amount of videos with that probably with that title. Not necessarily from me or from Thoth, but it is definitely one of those things where traditional witchcraft is now starting to slowly become the cool new thing that Wicca used to be. So, what is the difference between Wicca and traditional witchcraft? Well, for one, Wicca is a religion. Is a religious practice of witchcraft that started around 20th century, so around 1930s to 1950s. I think 1950s was really when it started taking off, thanks to the repeal of the Witchcraft Act. Now, what it is really a system of approach. So when you have Wicca, you have books and people which, Gerald Gardner created essentially a system of magic. Whether he called it Wicca or whether we now just call it Wicca doesn't really matter, but essentially when I say the word Wicca, you know what that means. That means that kind of Gardnerian or Alexandrian system of magic. So what about traditional witchcraft? Well, traditional witchcraft is kind of being inspired by, so your working practice is inspired by traditional approaches to magic, traditional magical practitioners. So it doesn't mean a lineaged tradition. Like, you could say this is a lineage tradition in that someone creates a coven, initiates someone else, who initiates someone else, who initiates someone else. Not that kind of traditional witchcraft tradition. Traditional witchcraft is in old-fashioned, old school, the older way of doing things. So the real difference is that Wicca comes with a structure. Now the structure does change slightly because it will change from person to person. But at the end of the day, you're probably still going to be doing the Sabbats. You're probably still going to be using elements. You're probably still going to be casting circles. You don't necessarily have any of that in traditional witchcraft. Okay, so traditional witchcraft is either you as an individual or a group taking inspiration through historical figures, famous witches of the past, your local land and folklore particularly, and then also classic history, classic mythology, that sort of thing, and you're melding that together. The main difference really is what tends to be the case that I see is that this is a structure that's evolved from one particular tradition and it doesn't change all that much throughout the world. Whereas if you look at authors that write books on traditional witchcraft, such as Gemma Gowrie, they're very much linked to picking up on people of a specific place and then you recreating or being inspired by those specific people or that specific culture. So in traditional witchcraft, of course, you would look at, okay, what is in the current area that I'm in and how does that flavour the type of magic or witchcraft I'm practicing? Do I live in a fishing village? If you are, then it's going to be more of a sea witchery style practice. The fact that this has been a fisherman's village or fishing village for however many hundreds, if not even maybe thousands of years, that's going to change the folklore, the spirits that are connected to that land. If you live in a desert, that is going to, have a big impact on the spirits and the connection and what is growing, what's available in your land. If you live on the edge of the woods or in the country like I do, that's going to have a very specific, it's gonna your style of witchcraft and magic is gonna pick up on that because generally speaking, when you look at the cunning folk, which traditional witchcraft draws heavily upon. Cunning folk practitioners, their stories, classics, witches, and then when you look at the books where it actually gives, normally like this one here is West Country Witchcraft and Magic. I live in the West Country, my practice, I can pick up this book and there will be things and places mentioned in it which I go to, okay? So what you're really doing with traditional witchcraft is it's very much a case of drawing on figures throughout history and then researching the place that you're in, and then getting to know that place, so that that place and your magical system that you build, that is then a stepping stone for you to explore outside of that. So although you may think traditional witchcraft may be heavily associated with the land spirits and that sort of thing, in reality you might not necessarily be working with those. You might work with them a little bit, but it is a stepping stone. You know, what grows close by to you, what herbs, that sort of thing, you're going to use those and incorporate those into the magical practices and healing practices and the medicines and things like that that you would make in traditional styles of craft. Whereas when you take something such as hoodoo, or you take something such as Wicca, or you take, if we're talking about healing practices, Chinese traditional medicine, then yes, there's a system there, but what you're doing is you're drawing on stuff that you'd have to import. So, okay, this Wicca was created in the United Kingdom, in Britain, so a lot of it may look kind of, I don't like to use the term Celtic, but it may look quite Celtic. If you're going to take this and you've moved to Egypt, okay, then this evolved from Britain. You know, it is a workable enough system that you could take that and move somewhere else, but a traditional witch wouldn't really do that. What they would do is they would take the basic techniques that they've been given, and then they would model that and realign it, recalibrate it to the area that they're in. So of course, you know, unless you are a traveller, and you move around a lot, in which case that will probably be a big emphasis on your craft, because Gypsy Traveller community, you know, are very magical people. They have a massive magical tradition, where I live in the West Country. So when I look at and research books like this, or like this, and I look at the court records, and I ask old people, you know, who got any good stories of witches or something that lived nearby, there's thousands of them, literally thousands of them, that I can research and I can look up, and they name things, they name places that I go to and do my work at, you know. So you'd think it in terms of, oh well, this person 500 years ago used to do this in this area of land, you know, which is not really changed all that much. I mean, I live just on the edge of a city, between the city and the countryside, so, you know, a best of both worlds really. But in terms of what the practice looks like, of course, all forms of Wicca stem from Gardnerian, the Gardnerian coven, so Gerald Gardner, and then to a certain extent, if you're part of the Alexandrian tradition of Wicca, it will come from that, and it will draw heavily on that. Traditional witchcraft doesn't draw on those things. Yes, there are some people that have gotten together as groups and have created some kind of very loose structure, often not very strict, like the sorts of current structures and workings in Wicca often tend to be a lot more strict because they are a system, whereas I tend to see, as my personal opinion, is I see that when you look at traditional witches and when you look at Wiccans, because of the religious element and the doing the same thing, the Sabbats, that sort of thing, observing and a lot more worship, with this it tends to be more research and development, constantly adding and changing. You know, all these traditional witches tend to have, you know, practices that they've learned that have been inspired by things that they've researched in their local area and on their travels, and they'll go outside a lot more. Whereas a lot of this is, the springboard is the tradition that you've been taught, the way in which you've been taught, the rituals that you've formed, and the understanding and the symbology and magic that's being used in that rituals sometimes can hold you back. So, for example, Wicca's often relied a lot on gender magic. You have a high priest and a high priestess, you know. In traditional witchcraft, there may be none of that. You know, gender may not play a role whatsoever. You may not need a coven at all. You may be a coven unto yourself. You may not need anyone else in traditional witchcraft. In others, you may have a coven, you may have a group of people, but there's no male and female role in that, you know. So it varies. Think of it a lot like if we're talking Christianity, you've got Catholicism in that there's a structure there, an inherited structure there, and then you've got Protestantism, which is basically, okay, we're taking a couple of concepts, but they're so varied it's difficult to pin down different Protestant churches. I mean, if there's a long road and there's 10 churches and they're all Protestant on that road, they're not going to be that similar. They're all going to be very, very different. But if you get 10 Catholic churches on the road, they're actually going to be quite a lot similar. And that's kind of the approach that you should think of. I'm not using these two books because they're the be-all and end-all, but they illustrate the points in that, of course, Witch's Bible Complete by Janet and Stuart Farrar, which I will do a book review on at some point, shows you a system of religious practice and practice. All this does essentially is say, this practitioner did this practitioner did that practitioner did this, and you have to fill in the gaps. So they don't give you a structure very much in traditional witchcraft. It's a case of stories, folk tales, magical principles and practices, such as how do you use a crystal ball? Well, they might teach you how to use it, but in terms of a ritual, you would then build that. In terms of the use of why you would use it, what you're trying to contact, then that's going to depend very much on a case of, well, what is it you're trying to accomplish? There's no set standards, really. It's a hodgepodge of other people's practices that you're learning from them. You're trying to improve on them. You're taking someone else's story, someone else's knowledge, someone else's legacy, magical legacy to a certain extent, and then you're exploring and taking what worked for them and incorporating that into your practice. Now the difference is, of course, if you think of ceremonial magic, like ceremonial magicians will often do that, however it'll have a ceremonial approach, whereas traditional witchcraft is more of a case of what are the famous practitioners in this village, in this area, in this country I lived in. Granny Boswell, what did she do? Old James Baker, who lives down the road, what did he do? And then mixing that with the folklore of the land. And then really, again, traditional witchcraft is becoming more and more popular because there's more books being written about it. There are a lot of people, Wiccans, witches, that put themselves out there. You will find not very many. There are very, very, very few traditional witches that put themselves out there. This came out of the broom closet in the 1950s, okay? It pushed itself out. And to a certain extent has suffered because of it. Of course, Wicca, there's a lot of Wiccan bashing that goes on. There's a lot of people that say that it's a load of rubbish, that sort of thing, that it's weak and watered down. Whether you believe that or not is not my place to say. Obviously, Wicca has done a lot for the magical community in general, in terms of, the rights that they've managed to get us, But anyway, aside from that, because we're going on to a different subject, the traditional approach is basically a case of you're very much answerable to yourself. There is no morality in traditional witchcraft. There's no ethics in traditional witchcraft. You decide all of that. You decide everything and you put it together. It's a case of you building the system yourself, as opposed to being given a system that you're supposed to improve on. With traditional witchcraft, you generally build the system yourself. You don't really get given it. Even to a certain extent in some covens, in some groups that would be classed as traditional witchcraft groups. Well, I've seen them where they'll completely abandon their working rituals and practices and change them in the course of a year or so, because they want to go down a different route or a different path or explore a different place, and the rituals and procedures that they had, aren't necessarily ideal for that. So they'll completely change it all, you see. It's a very much, I find, research and development led, with a nod to the older ways of doing things. Because they do say, some say the older ways are the best ways, but, it's one of those things. If you're one of those people that like structure and you don't want to do a huge amount of magic, then this could be one for you to start off with, Wicca. because there are a lot of people, but given that it's a religion that is more devotional, yes, there are people that practice magic, but it is a devotional form of craft very often. Whereas this comes more from operational magic, you know, practical magic. So you've got the practical magic that you build up a system and explore the universe. You've got devotional kind of systems of magic and religion, which you learn and then use that as a platform to explore the universe. I've often found that this is a lot better for, you know, people that don't have a strong inclination towards religion. Traditional witchcraft is great because, of course, it's not a religion, whereas Wicca always is a religion. So there we go. Hopefully this didn't go on for too long, and I will talk a little bit more about Wicca and traditional witchcraft on the channel at some point, but I think it's better to do it justice by going into a little bit more detail on key areas as opposed to trying to overall. So hopefully you're not too offended if you're a traditional witch or a Wiccan witch by what I've said. But thanks for watching.